And hello. This is the Israel UAE Business Leaders Summit, the UAE-Israel Business Leaders Summit, and you're very, very welcome. My next speaker is Dan Senor. I'm Eithne Treanor, and I'm going to be with you for this session. Dan is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Startup Nation, the story of Israel's economic miracle. Now, Dan is also a board member of Startup Nation Central, SNC. His background is steeped in international policy. He's an accomplished speaker as well as a seasonal political commentator. So while re-examining the tech sector in Israel and its monumental rise in recent years, Dan is the very expert that we needed to talk to. So I'm delighted to welcome him here. Dan Senor, thank you so much for joining us.
Really, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. It's a very exciting conference.
Dan, I mean, just going through your book, and that's a few years ago, but looking at what's going on, it's really, there's so much going on in the last few years there. And even in this year alone, I believe the Israeli tech funding jumped, I don't know, around 25%, something like that, to almost $10 billion. So great news for Israel. So obviously, you're all doing something right there in terms of the sector. What's so attractive about this sector at the moment?
Well, for one, actually, I think we just passed $10 billion. Israel just passed $10 billion in attracting global venture capital, which is the highest per capita for any country in the world. So Israel, if you think about innovation capital moving around the world, Israel attracts more global venture capital than anywhere on a per capita basis, more than the US, more than Europe, more than India, more than China. This 10 billion, when we wrote Startup Nation a decade ago, the number was about 2.5 billion. Now it's 10 billion. And it's a little over 10 billion, and it's up, 25% since 2019, whereas the US was only up 5%. So what's going on? What are people backing? You have this incredible ecosystem in Israel, right? You have, thousands and thousands of startups, the highest density of startups in the world, 6,000 to 7,000 startups. There's a startup in Israel for almost every 11 or 1,200 Israelis. You've got this incredible ecosystem of academic institutions and research institutions, over 1,000 academic institutions that are doing real research, many of them doing very deep tech. And then you have all these multinational corporations that have set up shop in Israel and are building R&D centers. Israel's become like the R&D center for the world. And again, not just low-tech R&D, but really, really deep tech, deep experimental work to solve really messy problems for some of the top companies in the world. So you look at any major tech company in the world, just about any major tech company in the world, global tech company, they've set up shop in Israel and they're hiring Israelis. And even non-tech companies like Procter & Gamble and Coca-Cola and General Motors that you don't think of as tech companies, but because in order to survive, they have to have a technological edge, and then they're setting up shop in Israel. So you have this swirl of activity, research institutions, multinational corporations set up, these a vibrant venture capital scene, and then thousands and thousands of startups.
I mean, it just sounds like the perfect formula, really, doesn't it, for the success that they've actually got in place. Talk to me a little bit about the sectors that are really thriving. Are we looking at health, agri, cyber security? I mean, what really stands out for you?
Israel's playing in just about every tech sector. It used to be more narrow, but it's pretty broad now in terms of the range of sectors. The ones that are most interesting, I think most interesting to the region, include agri-tech, so coming up with really interesting technological solutions for agriculture, how to increase the yield using artificial intelligence, using precision technology, using machine learning to increase the yields on agricultural, plots and lands all throughout the world. For instance, in India, Israel's doing an enormous amount of work with India to kind of increase the yield on these farms. If Israel can help India increase its agricultural yield by 5 or 6 times, it'll unleash a second agricultural revolution on the subcontinent. So ag tech is big. Water tech, drip irrigation is a big area. Food tech, food security is a growing sector. Cybersecurity is obviously thriving, and it's always been an Israeli strength, an Israeli sweet spot. Digital health, so computer-assisted remote digital care was a big sector for Israel before COVID. It's even now an even bigger sector because most of the people in the world today, tragically, who've suffered from COVID, who've developed antibodies, do not actually go. If you have bad symptoms, you go to the hospital, but most people actually don't want to go to the hospital. Most people get treated, or certainly get diagnosed and treated remotely. So digital health startups enable that remote diagnosis and remote treatment. That's a booming area for Israel. And then you start to see the intersection of all these sectors. So if you take, for instance, digital health and cybersecurity, why does the intersection matter so much? Privacy matters a lot. The security of our technological tools matter a lot. We need to have confidence because we're doing more and more remotely in the security of these technology tools and platforms we're depending on. And so Israel's strength in not only say cybersecurity, but taking another area like digital health and combining the two to make sure every digital health experience is a secure one as much as possible. So it's sort of this network of networks, sort of sector of sectors that's blossoming in Israel. So it's food tech, it's agri-tech, it's water tech, it's digital health, it's cybersecurity, AI, which touches really all of these areas, is an area that's booming in Israel. So, Israel's even been playing in the consumer internet space, which it wasn't when we first wrote Startup Nation 10 years ago, with companies like Waze, which was born in Israel, visualization technology like Mobileye. Computer vision is a big, big area in Israel, which Intel just bought Mobileye, but Mobileye's running for Intel. It's a Jerusalem-based company, is running for Intel its global autonomous and semi-autonomous vehicle technology innovation program globally. So there's just a number of areas that seem to be very exciting, not only for Israel, not only globally, but specifically for the broader Middle East.
Without a doubt. I mean, it's a very exciting and very dynamic time. And I think, to see Israel involved in all of that, everybody will naturally want to join them. I know here in the UAE as well, really looking at the ag tech, water tech, food tech. I mean, all of that, the nexus there, there's huge interest in it. And it's the type of, areas that's making headlines, but of course, AI and all of that. So definitely, without a doubt, the synergies that are there. And we'll talk about that, in just a minute. But before we do, and you mentioned, digital health, but also when you look at the world around us, how everybody very quickly adapted and adopted, digitalization. We're on the highway, so to speak, and there's no turning back on that. But other specific companies that Israel, put in place, and perhaps startups around the pandemic, particularly, and dealing with that.
Yeah, so I would. There are so many, and I'm reluctant to single out too many by name, but just to give you a sense, if you visit the Startup Nation Central Finder, so it's Startup Nation Central, the organization you mentioned in the intro, which I'm a co-founder of, on the board of, which really seeks to deepen ties between the Israeli innovation ecosystem and the global innovation economy, and we basically serve as a GPS, if you will, for companies, governments, research institutions, investors that want to come to Israel to buy companies, invest in companies, do deep research to solve real problems, and they need to navigate the Israeli ecosystem. That's what we do. We work with them to do that. And in fact, we're now excited to work with the UAE to help investors and research institutions and governments that want to help Israel and the UAE collaborate. And if there's Emirati players that want to do more in Israel, if there's Israeli players that want to do more in the UAE, kind of be a facilitator to really deepen the strategic nature of those relationships. And on our website, there's something called the Finder, which basically what we have, the Finder, the Startup Nation Central website, keeps track of every single startup, every single company in Israel. So you can search by sector, you can search by investors backing it, you can search however you want to find these companies. And we right now have a special section for Israeli tech solutions to coronavirus. We have about 300 to 400 startups that are either have taken off since the coronavirus or were already in business and functioning pre-coronavirus and have adapted to come up with solutions. So you take a company like Vocalis, which is a company in the greater Tel Aviv area that uses voice technology, basically voice biomarkers, to actually diagnose coronavirus without having to do a saliva test, without having to do a nasal test. You can actually talk on your phone to someone who monitors the biomarkers, and the biomarkers can indicate whether or not there are early, before there are even noticeable symptoms of coronavirus. And so there's lots of these companies that deal in the diagnostic phase, in the contact tracing phase. And so, and obviously Israel's playing in the vaccine space too, but the most interesting, I think, exciting spaces for the Israeli startup community as it relates to coronavirus are in diagnostics and in the contact tracing.
Yeah, I like that phone idea. It sounds a lot more comfortable getting a coronavirus test. Actually, we might be signing up for that one big time. I think they'd have a lot of customers. But again, I mean, I've looked at, the site, and it's actually all of these resources, of course, you put them out there for free where people can actually research and look at all of that. I mean, it's just a tremendous mine of really, really fascinating information, and information that people can really get great value out of as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, we have plenty of delegations. Pre-COVID, we would have, and any given week, Startup Nation Central is hosting delegations, as I said, from, continents around the world, like virtually every continent. We're hosting delegations. They're companies, they're research institutions, they're governments at every level: national governments, state governments, provincial governments, municipal governments, sending delegations to Israel. It's just nonstop. People wanting to either say, how did Israel do it? How can we learn from the Israeli experience? Or how can we partner with Israel? How can we partner with Israel to solve our biggest problems? And what we realized is there was no single address in Israel to greet all these players. So all these people are visiting Israel. Now, they may visit a particular university or a particular hospital or be hosted by a particular venture capital fund, but each of those institutions, rightly so, have the agenda of their own particular portfolio at play when they host a delegation. What we realized is there was no central entity that has no equities in any one company or any one investment fund or any one single research institution or any single government body. We're just a non-conflicted GPS system. Come here, tell us the problems you're trying to solve, and we'll help you see what we think are the best in Israel, harvested from our finder, which is the digital product, if you will, or the digital manifestation, digital expression of all the due diligence and research we do. And we'll just try to connect you with who we think are the best players in the sector that addresses the problem you're trying to solve.
So how can we partner? When you look at the UAE and you look at, the new entry, into this market here, how can we actually partner? What do you think, Israel should be looking at outside its borders, and what should we be looking at in terms of the market that's here in the UAE? And again, a very tech savvy country. There's so much going on here in the tech space, and also wanting to be part of it and really be part of a very, very vibrant community. Where do you think there are areas that there might be some good synergy?
I spoke in 2013 in Abu Dhabi at the Abu Dhabi Digital Media Summit. And, at the time, having, a co-author of a book about the Israeli innovation miracle, the Israeli economic miracle, come speak in, any country in the region outside of Israel was, a big deal. Obviously now it's the new normal. I mean, as you and I have joked, that the line in Israel right now is the quickest way to solve traffic problems in Israel is to announce a technology summit in the UAE. Because whenever there's a UAE technology summit announced, it seems like tons of Israelis are traveling. The numbers are extraordinary. So Israelis are coming to UAE in large numbers. We believe it is key that all those human-to-human interactions are really important. And I'm struck by how many, someone mentioned to me the other day, this venture fund called Maniv Mobility, which is an Israeli venture capital fund that focuses exclusively on mobility, the future of transportation. And I think they were one of the first Israeli venture funds after the Abraham Accords were announced to invest in an Emirati startup. So one of the founders of the venture fund told me he's on a WhatsApp chat with like 50 entrepreneurs, 25 Israelis, 25 Emiratis, and they're just in this constant conversation. And there's a lot of that already happening. And obviously the Abraham Accords have really opened that up. We think the opportunities are, in addition to specific sectors, because when we speak to leaders in the UAE, they say, look, we want to do a lot more work in AI. We want to do a lot more work in cybersecurity. We need to do a lot more in food security and agri-tech. So these are all, digital health, the future of healthcare are all urgent needs for the UAE and big parts of the region. So Israel can really partner in those areas, university partnerships, a research institution, and then backing companies from each country, right? Emirati investors backing Israeli companies, Israeli investors backing Emirati companies. So there's a lot of joint work that could be done there, but there's also a lot of mentoring, right? Israel has gotten very good out of a tiny country, a little over 9 million people, is now home to building companies that are truly global companies. When we wrote Startup Nation, Israel really was just a nation of startups. Now it's a nation of startups and scale-ups. Israelis have learned how to build big companies. There are over 40 unicorns right now in Israel, which is just astonishing. Startups valued well over $1 billion. And you're seeing companies going public and exiting when they are large companies, no longer just built to flip anymore. I mentioned Mobileye before. Mobileye is a multi-thousand employee company that's running a massive global division for Intel. So Israel is scrappy with its startup entrepreneurs, and they're getting very sophisticated and very experienced in how they build companies. And to the extent that they and the investor base, which in Israel, the venture capital community, can work with Emirati entrepreneurs and help mentor them and help work with them in building companies that can then target the region, the markets in the region. So if you look at the broader Middle East region, you're talking about a market of 600 to 700 million people in terms of an addressable market that is really underserved on the internet today, on the consumer internet. If you look at the languages that are through the roof, based on a range of metrics that are widely penetrated, permeating the consumer internet. Obviously, Chinese is, the English language is, Spanish is, Arabic is actually underserved. And what's missing is a platform and a community of great. There's some, but there could be way more relative to its size and relative to its wealth of companies that could be really penetrating the market. And the UAE seems the natural launching pad for building and incubating those kinds of companies. And what Israel can do, and Israeli entrepreneurs can do, and Israeli researchers and investors can do, is to work with those entrepreneurs in the UAE and help them build those companies that could become major platforms in the region, because Israelis know how to build these companies. They know how to build these companies from a small domestic market, from a small population, from a small base, from an isolated place, and build companies that then go global. They go global from day one. And I think there's huge opportunity for Israelis and Emiratis to work together to build companies that could become the dominant players in the region.
Absolutely, I think, and to learn from what has gone on. There's no point reinventing the wheel because there's so much in place. But from the time you wrote the book until now, and I mean, I know 10 years is a century when it comes to, it's a lifetime when it comes to the tech market right now. It's moving so fast. But what do you think has changed? Clearly, the Israeli market has matured in many ways, you said, from startup to scale up, and the great work that's going there. But what else has changed in the country to get it at such a level right now?
Well, look, I think that the idea that Israelis, as I said earlier, to your point, that Israelis could only build startups but didn't know how to build big companies, I think that's changing, as you and I have addressed. Two, the idea that Israelis don't know how to come up with products and services that have a consumer appeal, that are that like via the consumer internet and elsewhere. So that has changed. At the time, Israel helped develop all this technology that was embedded in the products we used, whether it was embedded in our laptops, whether it was embedded in our cell phones, whether it was embedded in a range of products that we use, but they weren't the front-facing brand that consumers were coming into contact with. That's changed. Israelis, I cited Waze as an example, right? They come up with this travel app, this navigation app, and it sells to Google for over $1 billion. And Google keeps a big part, while they moved part of the Waze team to Mountain View, California, they kept a big part of the team in Israel so they could keep building and innovating in Israel. And now it's a consumer internet application that's used by virtually everyone, and anyone behind a wheel anywhere in the world on any continent. So Israel's gotten a lot better about learning about how to market, how to develop and market consumer applications. I think the other big change is Israel is playing in just about every deep tech sector. When we wrote Startup Nation, it was in a handful of sectors. Now it's playing across the board. And then lastly, I would say so when we wrote Startup Nation, there were about 120 multinational companies that had set up shop in Israel. So from Israel's, like, say, from year 0 to year 60, you had, over the course of approximately 6 decades, you had, 100, somewhere between 100 and 200 of these multinational corporations. We now are 2.5 times that in 10 years. So in the last 10 years, 2.5 times, virtually every major, as I said earlier, every major global tech company has set up shop in Israel, and major Fortune 100 non-tech companies have set up shop in Israel. And so that is a huge growth area, and is kind of helps with the like the flywheel, if you will, of Israeli innovation, because you have these startups and then you have big companies setting up shop there. These big companies now are in greater contact with the Israeli startups, presenting them problems that they need to solve at their headquarters, at their big companies. So the information flow has become more seamless because every major global company is now set up shop in Israel. So that's changed. And I would say these diplomatic breakthroughs are a big part of the story, right? I mentioned India earlier. So let's take India as an example. In 2017, I mean, Israel and India had virtually no diplomatic relations. I mean, it was, at best, they were very cold. In 2017, the Prime Minister of Israel flew to Israel, was greeted by Prime Minister Modi. The Prime Minister brought a delegation of business leaders, of academics. Startup Nation Central was involved with the trip. And they spent 3 days with Modi in Israel, saying, and Modi was basically saying, let me show you all the problems we have to solve. Most of them were of an agricultural nature that needed agri-tech solutions. Israel and India, as I said, have, these 28 centers of excellence that they had developed to work together throughout India to solve problems that can only come from really interesting Israeli agricultural tech solutions. And so that was a major breakthrough. Within, a year and a half later, Prime Minister Modi led a delegation to Israel. And since then, India and Israel have been just deepening and deepening their ties. And I could take that story and extrapolate it to just about every part of the world. In Africa, it feels like every other week, there's over 50 countries in Africa. Almost every other week, it seems that there's a delegation from Israel traveling to a different a different African country they have basically really big problems to solve, and they have very low barriers to solving those problems. They don't have tech, so they need tech help. But they are, when I say they have low barriers, meaning the government isn't standing in the way, the regulatory regimes aren't standing in the way. To the contrary, the governments in many of these countries want to solve problems. They just need partners. And so these diplomatic breakthroughs throughout the world, including Europe, including throughout Latin America, all across Asia, have been extraordinary. And so the world is really now Israel's oyster, and in terms of being able to work with business communities and governments around the world to solve big tech problems. That's a big change from when we wrote the book 10 years ago. And now the newest chapter is what's happening in the UAE, because this is now in Israel is doing all this global innovation, problem solving, and partnership work around the world with just about every part of the world except its own region. And now the regional opportunity, given the size of the population, the amount of capital in the region, in the Middle East, and the size of the problems that need to be solved, it's like tailor-made to have a Silicon Valley in your own backyard. And now the broader Middle East has access to this Silicon Valley that's been sitting in its own backyard. And when you talk to Israelis in this Silicon Valley, it's the second most important ecosystem in the world after the real Silicon Valley. When you talk to business leaders in the broader Middle East, they say, look, if we wanted to partner with Silicon Valley, we had to travel 20 hours to get to Silicon Valley. Now we have a 3-hour flight, direct flight to Israel, or Israelis have a 3-hour direct flight to us. Now, if you look at this trend that's been going on over the last few years, where Silicon Valley is extremely important, but less so. It's less indispensable. Meaning,
absolutely. I was going to ask you about that, and indeed just other areas as well, because again, we look at the amount of Israeli companies that's listed on the NASDAQ, and again, that success, that trajectory that has just been on the way up. So what's happening? It's obviously taking investment money from probably Silicon Valley, from other areas. So give us a feel for what's still, Silicon Valley is obviously still important, but what's going on also in China and perhaps other areas too?
Yeah, so as it relates to NASDAQ, there are more Israeli companies listed on NASDAQ today than companies from any country in the world outside, obviously, the U.S. and China. So Israel's punching way above its weight on the NASDAQ. And when we talk about these companies, right? When we talk about venture investors, when we talk about NASDAQ listings, what is this an expression of? Venture capital investors, and obviously it's often venture-backed companies that wind up on the NASDAQ. Venture-backed investors are looking to solve the biggest problems in the world. Where can they get the best returns to solve the biggest problems in the world? So global venture capital is ultimately the sort of the clearest metric of technological promise, because investors are not investing for any other reason. They're not doing it for charity. They're investing because they want to solve big problems. So where that capital winds up tells you they are doing their due diligence and landing in one place or one of a few places. But the number of places is growing. To your question, when we wrote Startup Nation, a decade ago, something like 80% of global venture capital was winding up in Silicon Valley, and today it's about 50%. So one out of every two innovation capital dollars are landing somewhere else other than Silicon Valley, other than the Bay Area in California. Now, some of it is winding up in China. Obviously, some of it's winding up throughout Europe and places like London and Berlin. A lot more of it, as we talked about earlier in our conversation, is winding up in Israel. But the fact that global venture capital investors have less of a Silicon Valley centric mindset is very healthy for the Middle East, because it shows that they're very comfortable deploying capital wherever there are big problems to solve. They've been doing it in Israel. I think they'll continue to do it in Israel, but they're not going to only do it, as far as the region is concerned, in Israel. And I think the opportunity for Israeli entrepreneurs to partner with Emirati entrepreneurs to build companies that solve regional problems is going to be very attractive to venture capital investors who have less of a geographic centric priority list when they're deploying capital.
And that's so important. But again, you just bring that sense of dynamism and all the activity that's going on. It must make your life just very exciting and wonderful and interesting at the moment. But talk to me just a little bit. We only have about 4 minutes left on this. It's gone so fast. There's so much information I want to get from you. But is there a danger at the moment that everybody is going to get caught up, I suppose, in the excitement, the euphoria of what's going on? It's great. The avenues are open. Everybody can do business. But we haven't done it maybe before. Do we know each other? Do we know the regulations? Do we know how to actually do business with each other? Would there be a word of perhaps caution you might put out there for people?
Yeah, my only cautionary note is both sides need to think strategically. As we joked earlier, you're going to have a lot of Israelis traveling to the Gulf, to the UAE. You're going to have a lot of Emiratis traveling to Israel, and there's going to be a lot of pitches for a lot of deployment of capital in this company, in this venture fund, on both sides. And I think it's important to take a step back and to think a little strategically. Obviously there are projects that deserve very specific attention, and there are going to be companies that are very exciting, and investors, say in the Gulf, are going to want to invest in some of these Israeli companies. But I also think it's important to take a step back and say, for leaders in the UAE to say, who am I actually dealing with on the Israeli side? How do I vet them? How do I learn about them? A senior Emirati government official said to me, look, if a delegation from France, these are his words, if a delegation from France travels to the UAE, I've got like 12 contacts in the UAE who I really trust that I can help vet that business delegation with before they arrive. He says, we don't really have that with Israel yet. And so I think it's very important to develop that. We think Startup Nation Central can play an important role there, and because we're non-conflicted. We're not pushing into this venture fund or to this startup or to donate to this hospital or this research institution. We're basically saying, tell us the problem you need to solve. We have a good map of the entire ecosystem, and we will put you in front of the relevant companies and venture funds and research projects that we think could be a good fit for the problem you're trying to solve. And so being able to have trusted partners that can help the UAE navigate this ecosystem, and also thinking strategically in terms of, it's not just this one company or this one venture fund, but what kind of partnerships can we form to solve real problems and take the region to the next level? So should we go deep on AI together? Should we go deep on agri-tech or education tech or food security tech? Should we partner together and think strategically about how to not just back one company, but have a much higher level, almost nation to nation strategic play. It's one our organization wants to play a big role in, as we can think we can help a lot. And we also think this is a very healthy way to think about this incredibly exciting and incredibly promising future for these two countries.
Indeed. I mean, I think it's very clear that the synergy is there, and it has to be a win-win for everybody. And I think certainly that's the way the UAE will approach it, without a doubt. And again, a very exciting and dynamic time. And really, Dan, I want to thank you so much. Thank you for your great insight, your great experience in this. And we'll all be keeping an eye at Startup Nation Central, because that's where it's the source of information. So thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot. Have a great conference.
And again, thanks to all of our viewers out there who've been with us on day one. This is the UAE-Israel Business Leaders Summit, and this is brought to you by Gulf News and Harrods The Marker. We're delighted that you've joined us for this. This concludes our coverage for today. We're going to be back tomorrow at 1700 Gulf Standard Time, the time here in the UAE. So just adjust your clocks there and make sure that you join us. We have some great insights and some great speakers again for you tomorrow. So for myself, Dan Senor here, and all of the team at Gulf News and at Harrods The Marker as well, I bid you good evening. Thank you so much for being with us.